Good afternoon. The Subcommittee on the Interior, Energy, and the Environment will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today, our subcommittee will examine the federal permitting process under the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA, and the Clean Water Act. Numerous reports have documented how convoluted requirements and lengthy application periods for federal environmental permits negatively affect infrastructure and development projects. Today's hearing will explore the problems and inefficiencies within those permitting processes in order to highlight opportunities for reform. NEPA was passed with good intentions nearly 50 years ago, but over time has evolved to become one of the most burdensome regulations facing any development project. NEPA review for complex projects that require environmental impact statements can take years to complete and cost millions of dollars. The time for full environmental review for a highway project has now grown from approximately 2 years when NEPA was first implemented in the 70s to over 7 years in 2013. Even that seems quick compared to the 17 years it took one company to get a permit for mining in western Montana. State and local governments are forced to navigate the bureaucracy of a myriad of federal agencies in order to get a project approved under NEPA. In addition to all the red tape, applicants face the constant threat of litigation brought by environment groups and other opponents to development. Even the most minor oversight in the review process can prompt a lawsuit from activists, adding further delay on top of an already lengthy process. The permitting program established in Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is similarly plagued by lengthy delays and high cost for applicants. One of the witnesses we will hear from today has been waiting nearly 30 years for a permit, and the project remains in limbo. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers share responsibility for administering this program. And over the years, they have used their regulatory authority to expand the jurisdiction of the program and their own authority. The requirements for Section 404 permits are vague, and reports indicate that enforcement varies from district to district. This makes it very difficult for applicants to know what's required of them for a successful application. There's also no time limit imposed on the review process, so permit applicants face significant uncertainty and have difficulty planning for when they can begin work. Not only is navigating the permit process difficult, there is also no guarantee that a project will be allowed to proceed. In 2013, the Supreme Court held that the EPA has the authority to retroactively veto Section 404 permits issued by the Corps. In that case, the permit had been issued for 4 years prior to the EPA's decision to veto it, and the permit holder was in full compliance with the conditions of their permit. When a project can be arbitrarily vetoed midway through development, it's difficult, if not impossible, to attract investors and creates enormous disincentives to undertake any project requiring a 404 permit. Some of our panelists have had particularly egregious experiences trying to get a permit, and I look forward to hearing their perspectives on the issue. I hope this hearing provides a starting point for productive discussion about ways to improve the federal permitting process and get American infrastructure and development back on track. I'll now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Plaskett for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here with us this afternoon. We can all agree that environmental protection should go hand in hand with economic development. The Virgin Islands, which I'm proud to represent, is a beautiful place that thrives on tourism and understands more than most places the importance of striking the balance between environmental regulations and development. Excuse me. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, our nation faces an infrastructure investment deficit of $2 trillion. For instance, the estimated $1 trillion is needed to fix America's drinking water infrastructure. Our nation's transit system has a backlog of projects to attain a state of good repair that will cost $90 billion and is projected to grow to $122 million. America's public school system needs $58 billion to maintain and operate current facilities and an additional $77 billion to upgrade the current school facilities to reduce the maintenance backlog. In my district, the public schools are forced to run on 4-hour rotations because of the destruction to school facilities during the recent hurricane season. This is expected to continue at least through the next school year until new facilities can be constructed. Finally, America's roads and bridges are in need of $836 billion to repair a system that has been underfunded for years. Unfortunately, President Trump's infrastructure proposal aggravates the infrastructure deficit. The Trump plan would cut more than $168 billion from federal highways, Amtrak, and water infrastructure funding over 10 years. President Trump also proposes retreating from the federal government's lead role in financing infrastructure. The federal government historically funded 80% of the highways and 20% would be funded locally. This new plan reverses the percentages and requires states to contribute 80% of projected costs in order to receive 20% match. State officials know that requiring an 80% local cost share for an eligible project is going to put most, if not all, projects out of reach. In the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, it makes them basically out of the question. The plan is little more than a wish list. It wishes that state and local governments and private investors will make up for reduced federal investment in infrastructure. But we don't have the luxury of magical thinking. The civil engineers determined the inadequate infrastructure costs every American family $3,400. Isn't it time we face up to the fact that we cannot avoid the cost of investing in our infrastructure? There is also much progress to be made in permitting. In the Virgin Islands, where the cost of living is 33% higher than even the District of Columbia, every dollar in local economy is crucial to the survival of the islands, and we cannot afford drawn-out delays in permitting for economic development projects. But there are ways to speed up projects that will not lead to environmental damage. Permitting agencies should have enough funding to complete reviews quickly, and coordination tools already available should be fully implemented. The most common factor delaying water and transportation projects is inadequate funding. What we need is long-term federal support. That should be our priority. Thank our witnesses for sharing their testimony today and look forward to this important discussion.
Thank you very much. And now I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. First, we have Mr. James Iwaniski. Did I get that right?
Iwaniki.
Iwaniki, all right. That wasn't even close to what was the phonetic spelling in my notes. I'm sorry, Mr. Iwaniki. He's the engineer manager of the Marquette County Road Commission in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We have Ms. Valerie Wilkerson, Vice President and CFO of the ESG companies in Virginia. Mr. Kevin DeGood, Director of Information Policy at the Center for American Progress. And Ms. Diane Katz, Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to the committee rules, all witnesses are to be sworn in before they testify. Would you all please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written testimony will be made part of the record. And as a reminder, you've got a clock in front of you, and you've also got 3 lights. Green means go, yellow means hurry up, and red means stop. Please also turn your microphone on, and the budget-conscious folks we are, we did not buy the most expensive microphone, so they sound much better the closer you get to them. So now we will recognize Mr. Iwaniski. Did I get that? I'm getting closer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Ranking Member and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify in the federal permitting process under the Clean Water Act. I'm Jim Iwaniki. I'm the engineer manager of the Marquette County Road Commission in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I'm very familiar with the Clean Water Act permitting process. Over the last 5 years, my agency has averaged over 20 Clean Water Act permits per year. I'm here today to testify about my experience in trying to permit County Road 595 in order to improve the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens, along with having a positive economic impact on mining, logging, recreation, and tourism in the state of Michigan. The Michigan DEQ was ready to issue a permit for County Road 595 pursuant to Federal Clean Water Act. EPA vetoed the state's position and stopped the permit from being issued. That is why I'm testifying about a road that never was, and counsel for the Road Commission is in federal court seeking the opportunity to challenge EPA's veto. EPA's veto has caused heavy truck traffic to be routed through populated areas of Marquette County, through a university campus, 3 cities, and next to schools. In January of 2012, the Road Commission submitted a 404 permit application for County Road 595. It was 21 miles in length, affected 26 acres of wetland, and it was a common sense solution to a transportation need in the county. The cost of the project was $83 million. It was going to be funded through a public and private partnership with Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto was interested in the partnership because they were building a new nickel mine called the Eagle Mine, and they were refurbishing an old iron mill, the Humboldt Mill. The distance between the mine and the mill as a crow flies is about 19 miles. The existing road system to go to the mine and to the mill is over 60 miles one way. 595 would have reduced travel time by an hour, and 595 would have been built in a working woods, not a pristine wilderness. EPA only wanted to talk about preservation and would not allow us to use creation for a wetland mitigation plan. EPA continually to change the rules for wetland mitigation. In June of 2012, they said a 20-to-1 ratio would cover direct and secondary impacts of the project. By the way, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality replacement ratio is 12-to-1 max. We propose to preserve 2.5 square miles next to the McCormick Track. The McCormick Track is a federally protected wilderness area in the Ottawa National Forest. We propose 640 acres of high-quality wetlands, a 25-to-1 ratio, plus 929 acres of upland for a total of a 60-to-1 ratio. In December of 2012, the EPA wanted additional mitigation for secondary impacts and gave the Road Commission less than 30 days, including Christmas and the New Year's holidays, to come up with a solution. EPA also wanted us to secure mineral rights for the wetland preservation area. Federal rules only say to protect sites to the extent appropriate and practicable. EPA would not allow local units of government to be the land steward of the preservation area as allowed by law. Michigan Department of Natural Resources volunteered to be the land steward. They manage 4.6 million acres for the state of Michigan. When we told the EPA that they were willing to do that, their response was, we were not sure they were qualified, and they would have to check into it. EPA demanded creating wildlife crossings large enough to accommodate moose, bear, wolf, and cougar, but they would not tell us where they wanted these crossings. These may be NEPA requirements, but they are not requirements of the Clean Water Act when a state has assumed authority. EPA was unwilling to negotiate resolutions openly by telling us directly what would satisfy their issues. In fact, during the last months of the project, they would not even tell us who the decision maker was going to be so we could talk to them directly and come up with a solution. We had great political support for County Road 595. On the local, state, and federal level, it was bipartisan. The Michigan House and Senate approved. The governor of the state of Michigan approved. Dan Bednarczyk, at the time our Republican House representative, approved. And both of our Democratic senators, Carl Levin and Debbie Stabenow, approved of the project. Congress wrote the Clean Water Act specifically to allow states to assume Clean Water Act Section 404 permitting authority in place of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA. Michigan has done that. Congress should do what it can to see that the local and state elected officials who have followed the Clean Water Act requirements can act in the best interest of their community without arbitrary and capricious interference from EPA bureaucrats in Chicago and Washington. Congress should clarify the Clean Water Act. When a state has assumed Section 404 permitting authority and intends to approve the project, but the EPA objects, the permit applicant should be allowed to challenge EPA's objections as arbitrary and capricious in court. Thank you, and I would be willing to answer any questions that the panel has.
Thank you very much. Ms. Wilkerson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Plaskett, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify. My name is Valerie Wilkinson, and I am the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the ESG Companies, a small business based in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Home builders have become frustrated with the expansion of federal authority over private property and believe the current permitting process is broken. For almost 3 decades, we've been held hostage by the EPA and the Corps, who have continually altered the Clean Water Act 404 permit requirements. This is perplexing, as the relevant sections of the Act have not changed since 1972. Our nightmare began almost 30 years ago when our company proposed plans for a multi-use community to address the local housing demand. While we were clearing our land in 1989, the Corps asserted that our property contained jurisdictional wetlands and that a 404 wetland permit was required. We hired environmental experts to survey the land. However, the Corps completely dismissed their assessments. The delineation took years to complete because Corps officials disagreed on the criteria for determining wetlands. The regulatory environment changed again in 1999 when Virginia adopted the federal 404 regulations to create an expedited one-stop shop permitting process. Virginia DEQ staff confirmed our experts' delineation, and we submitted our state permit request. We agreed to revise our plan to further avoid and minimize impacts and provided mitigation so for every acre impacted, 2 acres of wetlands would be restored and another acre placed in preservation, resulting in no net loss of wetland acreage or functions. The DEQ applauded the fact that we exceeded the typical protective measures and issued a 15-year permit in 2003. Since the state and federal requirements are the same, we were stunned when the Corps disagreed with the DEQ's delineation and added 36.7 acres of impacted wetlands to the project. The basis of their decision for this 25% increase was vague and unsubstantiated. Although we strongly disagreed, we tried to move the permit forward by offering a number of amendments to our proposal that lessened the environmental impact and provided extensive alternatives analysis, which proved the other options unfeasible. 5 years after we received a state permit, the Corps, utilizing the same regulations, denied our request. The Corps wrongly claimed that we had not adequately addressed information requests, even though we had replied to every one, provided numerous off-site analysis, as well as 17 on-site alternatives, and addressed every public comment to multiple public notices. Frustrated, we modified our project again in an effort to stay out of court and salvage some of our extensive investment. The significantly reduced plan decreased wetland impacts by 84%, and the Corps accepted this as a modification to our original application. However, the Corps adopted a new regional supplement, which expanded the definition of a wetland, and we were forced to start over again with a new set of rules. Now, 13 years since first filing our federal application, we have responded to countless requests for information, studies, data, only to be met with more delays and requests to update and revise the information. We've hired more consultants and experts. Many of these requests appear to be just stalling mechanisms, yet we've complied again and again. We have been prevented from developing any of our 428 acres for almost 30 years, and our 15-year state permit will expire in 9 months. We have spent over $4.5 million in the process and over $40 million in our investment in the property, and we still are not close to a permit. If constructed, our project will create jobs, increase property tax revenue, and provide affordable housing. I hope that our story can be used to advance positive reforms and repair a broken regulatory system. Congress must work to pass legislation that streamlines permitting and establishes a process that offers transparency, certainty, and reasonable deadlines. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for what you're having to go through. Mr. DeGood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Plaskett, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify. It is a privilege to contribute to this committee's work. In recent years, environmental review and permitting have come under sustained attack, often based on spurious claims about the length of time needed to complete federal reviews. The President's infrastructure plan is only the latest example. The hard truth is that infrastructure projects cost money, yet when taken together, the President's budget and infrastructure plan call for cutting $1.40 from existing federal infrastructure programs for every $1 of proposed expenditure. The net cut would reduce total construction activity. In Washington, everybody wants to go to the ribbon cutting, but nobody wants to pay the bill. Instead of real spending, the President has proposed deep environmental deregulation. The White House and other opponents of environmental review paint a dire picture of a federal bureaucratic leviathan implacably churning out red tape to our collective detriment. If only, the argument goes, project sponsors didn't have to study the potential impacts of building, then everything would be cheaper, faster, and better. This tidy narrative is false. First, environmental review produces better projects and saves taxpayers money in the long run. History shows that building first and asking questions later often leads to irreparable social and ecological damage. Second, only a small fraction of infrastructure projects must complete a full review. And third, project review times for many categories of projects have actually fallen in recent years. In 1969, Congress passed NEPA to address growing public concern over the serious community and environmental damage caused by federal actions, including the construction of new infrastructure projects. The fundamental goal of NEPA is to allow informed decision-making by providing the public with detailed information on the potential harms associated with infrastructure projects. Failing to consider potential impacts from infrastructure projects is penny-wise and pound-foolish. Take, for example, the Kissimmee River in Florida. The river carries water south from Lake Kissimmee to Lake Okeechobee, which then releases water into the Everglades and recharges the Biscayne Aquifer, which provides drinking water to millions of residents of South Florida. In the early 1960s, prior to NEPA, the Army Corps reconstructed this 103-mile meandering Kissimmee River into a 56-mile-long, 300-foot-wide drainage canal in the name of flood control. The resulting environmental damage was so severe that Congress authorized the partial restoration of the Kissimmee River just 21 years after completion of the channelization project. When adjusted for inflation, the channelization cost $194 million, and the partial restoration will cost more than $1 billion, a five-fold increase in constant dollar terms. Opponents of review often argue that transportation projects, especially highways, face inordinate delays. In fact, only 4% of highway projects require a full environmental impact statement. Since 2009, the average review time for major highway projects has fallen to 3.6 years. That may sound like a lot, but it's important to remember that mega projects often come with mega complexities. By rushing environmental review, we increase the risk of funding infrastructure that will produce substantial social and environmental harms that could have been mitigated with a bit of forethought and planning. The push for further environmental deregulation is especially troubling since Congress has already voted 3 times in the past 6 years to speed the review process. In fact, federal agencies have yet to promulgate many of the regulations implementing reforms to NEPA included within MAP 21, WRDA, and the FAST Act. Moreover, the Trump administration has yet to appoint a director for the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council or to appoint a head of CEQ. In short, Congress has granted the federal executive numerous administrative and regulatory powers to speed the environmental review process. These reforms need time to be fully implemented and given time to work before further changes are made to law. Unfortunately, these facts haven't stopped the Trump administration from proposing to dramatically roll back review by shortening the statute of limitations for filing legal claims, allowing certain types of construction to proceed before review completion, and limiting the scope of alternatives analysis. These and other proposed changes would lead to less community input and greater environmental harms, including dirtier air and water. In many respects, the fight over NEPA is a fight about values and power. Environmental review is the process by which we value people, places, and the environment by trying to minimize the harms from development. Review also serves to empower local communities, moving critical information and decision-making out from behind closed doors where planners and developers tend to operate, yet without adequate time to study a project or the ability to seek legal remedy when mitigation efforts are inadequate, the concept of community and environmental protection lose their meaning. Weakening environmental review would simply add to our fiscal burden by rushing construction of poorly conceived projects that will require extensive remediation later on. There are no shortcuts to fixing our nation's infrastructure backlog. The only real solution is for Congress to once again make the investment necessary to ensure our country can prosper and compete for decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Katz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Farenthold and Ranking Member Plaskett and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Diane Katz. I am a Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy at the Heritage Foundation. The views expressed in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Proponents of President Trump's infrastructure initiative claim that it would create millions of jobs accelerate economic growth, and increase productivity. However, work must actually commence in order for benefits to accrue, and a variety of federal, state, and local regulations imposes years of delay and higher costs that serve little purpose except to empower the federal government and anti-development activists. Among the most problematic of these regulations are the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and the Section 404 permitting regime under the Clean Water Act. 4 decades of experience with both has exposed a raft of regulatory flaws, including politicized science, arbitrary standards, and protracted litigation. The average time, as the chairman referred to earlier, the average time to complete a NEPA impact assessment of a transportation project has expanded from 2.2 years in 1970 to 6.6 years in the past 5 years. Every day of delay increases project costs and postpones the benefits of modernized and safer infrastructure. NEPA is rendered largely obsolete by the vast number of categorical exclusions that agencies routinely grant to waive environmental reviews. The Federal Highway Administration alone grants more than 50 types of exclusions, and waivers constitute between 90% and 99% of state transportation projects. Even the Obama administration granted NEPA waivers to more than 95% of the projects funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. It makes us wonder what the use of a regulation is if 90% of the time its compliance is waived. The Clean Water Act Section 404 permitting is also a regulatory quagmire. There is no agreement between Congress, the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, state and federal courts, or the U.S. Supreme Court on the parameters of federal wetlands jurisdiction. The regulatory uncertainty is costly to individuals, businesses, and the nation. Shoddy science also exacerbates the chaos of Section 404 permitting. For example, the EPA established a scientific advisory board in 2013 to review the science on the connectivity of wetlands to downstream waters. The research was supposed to interpret the science on wetlands to help clarify federal wetlands jurisdiction. But EPA didn't wait for the results before revising the wetlands regulation in 2015, a revision that dramatically expanded federal powers over private property and spawned lawsuits nationwide. The regulatory complexity of infrastructure projects is magnified to the extent that interagency coordination is necessary. Federal agencies are constantly embroiled in political skirmishes, simultaneously called to account by Congress, the White House, courts, and activists. Each operate by a different set of regulatory procedures and few, if any, observe deadlines. These and other regulatory hurdles undermine U.S. competitiveness. The United States ranked a measly 15th out of 33 OECD countries for ease of permitting in the World Bank's 2017 Doing Business study. Even Estonia and Portugal ranked higher. And the U.S. only ranked as mostly free in 2018 in the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom. Since the passage of NEPA in 1969 and the Clean Water Act in 1972, there have been dramatic changes in America's economic, social, political, and environmental landscapes. Back then, NEPA was the vanguard of environmental protection, but today there is no shortage of other regulations to protect water and air quality, wetlands and endangered species, and to control runoff, hazardous waste, construction debris, demolition dust, and every other byproduct of infrastructure modernization. Going forward, any new infrastructure funding should be conditional on meaningful regulatory reform, starting with repeal of NEPA and the devolution of Section 404 permitting authority to states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll begin our questioning with the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might need about 30 minutes, but I'll try to do it in 5, maybe a little grace from the chairman. This is an issue close, near and dear to my heart and close to me, particularly with my district. Mr. Iwannicki, early last year, the committee held a hearing on environmental barriers to infrastructure development, and one of the witnesses was Richie Beyer. He's county engineer in Elmore County, Alabama. In his testimony, he used the example of a simple project to place a 1.5-inch thick wearing surface on roadway, and he noted that the completion, the project file will be 20 times thicker than the overlay that was placed on the road. That the cost on average would be 2 times more than a similar project funded solely with local funds. It was $160,000 per mile under the federal guidelines versus $80,000 at local only. And the project will have taken 9 to 12 months longer than if it had been a local project. And for all for a road that is materially the same regardless of the funding source. Does this track with your experience in Marquette County?
I would say it tracks perfectly with our experience in Marquette County. Our costs are much lower when we can use local money, and it's a locally bid project, and we have to follow the same regulations. But as soon as we get federal money involved, it skyrockets its cost.
How important is it to provide a reliable service on rural roads? This is a rural road.
The Marquette County Road Commission serves about 67,000 people, and we're the largest county in Marquette County. We have about 1,274 miles of local county road that we take care of. I have a $150 million need to fix our local roads, and that's with about a $14 million budget. So my constituents depend on the Road Commission to do the best they can with our limited resources to make smooth roads for them.
And you're certainly well aware that even though rural roads represent less than half of traffic in the United States, it represents over 50% of traffic fatalities.
You are correct.
Okay. On bigger projects, one in particular is in my district. It's the Northern Beltline. This was a project that was approved, funding was approved for this in 1989. Typically, it takes 15 to 20 years to complete a project like this. What this is the completion of the Beltline around the city of Birmingham of I-459. It's a federal project. It's a multi-lane highway. It is absolutely essential, not only for economic opportunity in the Birmingham metropolitan area, but for the whole region. It improves east-west traffic, for economic traffic between Atlanta and west and north-south traffic from the Gulf Coast north. And like I said, it typically takes 15 to 20 years. This was approved in 1989, and now they're saying that it's going to, that it might be completed in 2054. Ms. Katz? Would you like to comment on that?
What's ironic in those types of instances, and unfortunately they're not all that rare, is that many of these projects have environmental benefits that are foregone in the name of environmental permitting. If you have new road projects that are going to reduce the amount of traffic jams and so on, and make routes quicker, those are environmental benefits. There are also a number of public health and safety benefits to having more modern infrastructure. And so there's a lot that we lose. It's not just money that we lose. There are a lot of more important things that we lose when these projects and permitting go off the rails.
Let me read a couple of quotes from a Pew Charitable Trust report from State Line. About this, they actually talk about this project in Alabama, but here's a couple of statements. One from Philip Howard, founder and chairman of Common Good, a nonpartisan group focused on good government. He says, a delay is bad for the environment, it's bad for the economy, it's bad for jobs, it's bad for global competitiveness. There's nothing good about it. And here's a comment from Bill Reinhardt, editor of a monthly newsletter called Public Works Financing. He said, you delay the benefit the project was supposed to deliver. If the project was supposed to be delivered in 2012 and it isn't delivered until 2022, then you delay all the economic benefit, the lifestyle benefit, the employment benefit. You don't deliver the public good. The public suffers. How would you respond to that?
I'd say that's absolutely correct. And what's tragic about it is that it's avoidable.
It certainly is, Mr. Chairman. Going back, if I may, if you will indulge me for just another minute or so.
Without objection, the gentleman's recognized for another minute.
Thank you. Going back to the county engineer, Richie Byers' testimony, he's talking about a situation where they had a flood and it washed out a pipe. And they wound up having to get all the permitting, and they spent almost a quarter of the funding that was necessary for this just to get, before they could even start the project. What should have taken just a few weeks wound up taking months, and this was made the road impassable. That's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with right now. We've over-regulated ourselves, we're over-regulating our infrastructure, and it makes it extremely expensive, much more expensive than it ought to be. I think that's what we ought to be talking about in our infrastructure funding efforts. I yield back, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence. I'd also like to enter the Pew article into the official record, if I may.
Without objection, so ordered. We'll now recognize the ranking member for her questions for 5 minutes.
With the chair's indulgence, I would ask that Mr. Raskin go ahead of me.
We'll recognize the esteemed professor for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and Ms. Plaskett, thank you. Welcome to all of our witnesses. But I'm new to the whole issue, so I'm looking for clarification here, because I know it's being said that Section 404 is responsible for slowing down needed infrastructure improvements, and I know that this story has been invoked by the President in his infrastructure plan as well. And so I want to make sure I know exactly what the law is, so we're all clear in terms of the terms of the discussion. The NEPA requires federal agencies to evaluate the potential environmental effects of major actions. It does not prohibit any action at all. Is that right, Mr. DeGood?
That's correct. It's a procedural statute. And so it really requires that decision makers be methodical and transparent about considering the environmental impact of their projects. Is that right? Correct. Okay. Is it true that it forces all projects to go through a detailed environmental review process and environmental impact statements? No, I mean, it varies by project category, but it's usually in the single-digit percentages. Of all of the projects that are coming forward? Correct. Okay, and I've heard reference to the fact that 95% of projects are categorical exclusions. Is that because they just don't have sufficient environmental impact to make a difference? And what happens to a categorical exclusion project? How long does that take? Is that does it take years or months to get that through, or? You know, I can speak most directly about surface transportation and say that there are two kinds of categorical exclusions, those that are documented and those that are undocumented. For an undocumented, it can be a matter of a few days, and for a documented, potentially a few months, but almost never longer than that. So in the time it takes you to put together a bid prospectus, you can have all of this documentation wrapped up. So you're saying in more than 9 out of 10 cases, it would be a categorical exclusion, and you're talking about a matter of months or weeks or even a few days. Okay. Around 4% are environmental assessments. What does that mean, and how long does that take? So environmental assessments can vary quite a bit. If you're not sure whether or not your project is likely to have substantial impact, sometimes you'll undertake an environmental assessment, which is typically a shorter process that's a little less involved. And during that process, if you come across something that is going to be a significant impact, you can expand it to be a full environmental impact statement. And if not, you come to the end of that process and you have a finding of no significant impact, and you can proceed with your project. To show you that that's not just small projects in terms of either dollars or scope, here in Northern Virginia, the I-66 public-private partnership to expand that facility outside the Beltway had a two-step process. They first started with a Tier 1 EIS, but then ultimately were able to complete that entire environmental review under an environmental assessment. So it's not just that EAs apply to smaller projects or small dollar projects. They can apply to very big multi-billion-dollar facilities.
Okay, so 1% or fewer of the projects then require an environmental impact statement. How do I know if my project is going to require an environmental impact statement? Whose decision is that?
Well, ultimately, it's the federal government's decision, but you as the project sponsor are going to have a very good sense of that going into it. So if you're doing something like, say, repaving an existing state highway inside of the active right-of-way, it's likely that you're going to have a categorical exclusion. If you're engaging in a greenfield construction, which is to say you're building out into an area which is not currently developed, it's almost assuredly going to be the case that you need to have a full environmental impact statement.
Okay, so I've heard different people raise disagreements over this or that project, and obviously we can't relitigate the whole administrative process. That's why we have an administrative process. So without entering into the specifics of any particular project, is it the case that we could cut this process in a way that would save hundreds of billions of dollars for the economy, and does this really have hundreds of billions of dollars of impact on the economy?
No, I mean, many of the figures in the Common Good Report, I rebutted in a piece that we have up on our website. A lot of the assumptions and a lot of data in that just simply were not sound. There are not hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars worth of savings to be had from shortening or eliminating environmental review.
I mean, it sounds good. If we could do it, I think most people would want to do it, but it does seem, given that such a tiny fraction of the cases even go through the environmental impact statement stage, that it seems hard to believe. Okay, I think my time's up, so Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Katz, my first question is, can you describe the steps a local government or private developer must take to follow NEPA?
Probably can't account for all of them because there's so many, but if there is any nexus with the federal government in the project, then the company has to obtain a review or a categorical exclusion from the federal government. Contrary to what Mr. DeGood said, there's no way of knowing whether or not you will have to do an EIS because different agencies can make different decisions in different ways about what kind of assessment you'll have to undertake. That's just the very beginning of the process. There are, depending on the type of projects, a raft of state and federal regulations and permits that one has to apply for and receive.
Why is the process so slow?
Why is government so slow?
That's right.
You have different agencies all working in different ways at different time periods. And, I think if you had this going on strictly at the state level, there'd be a lot more accountability in terms of, getting people to act. Unfortunately, Washington doesn't much care about what's happening in Marquette. And it tends to move, and the federal government has so expanded its reach that it has so much to do, it just takes very long to do everything.
Let me ask, on average, how long does it take for an applicant to have signed off on their project to get sign off that their project is a NEPA complaint, on average?
The data I have is for transportation projects. And so it takes, on average now, almost 7 years, whereas in Europe, where they also do environmental permitting, it takes about 2 years.
That's bad that Europe with their type of government, can get it done that much faster than the United States. Let me ask, how can the process be improved to facilitate infrastructure growth?
Well, I don't think we need NEPA at all. I mean, NEPA was, developed in 1970, and since that time we have, a plethora of other environmental safeguards. Most agencies treat NEPA as pro forma anyway, so I think getting rid of NEPA would help. There are a lot of projects that don't undergo the most intensive assessments. The problem is that you never know which ones will, and those that do cost a great deal.
My last question, how you can explain, how does the high cost of permitting affect taxpayers?
This goes, to what we were talking about, opportunity cost. For every day of delay, the costs of federal projects increase, of course, and that leaves fewer resources to do a great many other things. Also, infrastructure improvements produce environmental, public health, and economic benefits, and all of those are delayed by regulatory barriers.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really
not to mention even the loss of our economic freedom. That's incalculable, of course.
Absolutely, and I appreciate your answers to the question. I appreciate everyone who testified. It's a goal of this Congress and this administration to try to reduce the regulatory burden. I appreciate the chairman for bringing this topic to be discussed today in committee, and hopefully this Congress can begin to take steps to try to ease the regulatory burden so that we can get more development done in the right way, but by significantly reducing the regulatory burden and compliance that's holding back the private sector and holding back local governments from expanding and investing in the infrastructure that they need. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We'll now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been talking quite a bit about infrastructure, and in my opening statement, I discussed the President's infrastructure plan with a budget cut of $122 billion from the Highway Trust Fund. Mr. DeGood, what would you predict would happen to the nation's highways if the plan to cut $122 billion goes into effect?
Well, I think we can say with a great deal of certainty that there would be a reduction in the total amount of maintenance and construction work happening around the nation. We should also recognize that the Highway Trust Fund is something that provides funding to every community, big and small, urban and rural. And one of the real challenges with the cuts that the President is proposing is that it would have this regional impact where places that are struggling economically would not be able to go out and raise the kinds of revenues that this administration is talking about them doing. And I think it would lead to further regional economic and social inequality.
I know that the civil engineers have given us a D+. With these budget cuts, I'm concerned about what our grade will be after that. Are you?
Absolutely. I think there would be some states and some metropolitan regions that have more dynamic economies today that might be able to raise additional revenues, and maybe those regions wouldn't fall behind. But I think that they're more the exception than the norm. For instance, this White House has pointed to a ballot initiative that was passed in Los Angeles County, Measure M, in 2016 by more than 2/3 of county voters. It's important to remember that Los Angeles County has an annual GDP of more than $700 billion. It's not particularly representative of the rest of the country. I myself am from Toledo, Ohio, and I know that Toledo does not look like Los Angeles and would struggle to try to match with that kind of revenue raising.
I don't think many of us look like Los Angeles. Having grown up in New York, I think that's a good thing, maybe not a bad thing. But one of the things that you were talking about in terms of just revenue growth in revenue, and for me, one of the other things that we look at when we talk about infrastructure is jobs and the importance of jobs. How many jobs could $2 trillion in infrastructure spending create? Is there an extrapolation that will be able to tell us what that is?
Rough estimates on federal infrastructure spending are that every $1 billion produces roughly 12,500 direct and indirect jobs per year. So if you want to talk about $2 trillion, you'd have to factor sort of over how many years that was. But if you're saying $200 billion a year, so 200 billion times 12,500 is a rough estimate of what the annual job creating power of that would be.
So at the same one, would $200 billion in cuts equal to so that's not a loss of jobs, but just jobs not realized, correct?
I think some of that's a loss of jobs and some of that's the jobs not realized. It partly depends on whether or not states would try to step up and fill that void. And as I mentioned previously, I think some would be able to and some would not.
Ms. Katz, you discussed that you didn't think that NEPA was really necessary, that it was pro forma in some respects. I know that Congress recently did reforms to NEPA. The FAST Act is supposed to have streamlined the permitting process and expand the list of activities that receive categorical exclusions from environmental review. Do you have any reports which show what the outcome of the FAST Act reform has been?
What I did for a recent report is that I went through both the MAP 21 Act, the FAST Act, and I'll tell you what it is in a second, the Safety LU Act, and I looked at whether the reform was optional or a requirement. And the vast majority of the so-called reforms were categorical exclusions, and there were a handful of requirements, and from what I've been able to tell, it hasn't done anything.
But how do we know what the effects of the FAST Act have been? You're looking at what the acts were supposed to give, but in fact, we don't have reports as yet on what the FAST Act, what the streamlining reports have shown to be able, because it's been so recent, has it not? I mean, Mr.
Well, it hasn't changed the fundamental problems with NEPA. That's why we...
But we don't know if Congress's reforms have actually have an effect as yet. Mr. DeGood, do you know what the effects of those reforms have been? Do we have statistical analysis as yet as to what Congress's reforms have done?
We do not. I mean, the simple answer is we do not. I believe there are 3 covered projects which have been put onto the FAST 41 dashboard, but because this administration has not appointed a director to that permit steering council, it's really not performing yet the way Congress had intended. So I think what we need to do is give it more time and push the administration to take advantage of all the authorities that Congress has already given them.
So my conclusion would be, and I see that my time is up at this point, is that Congress has done some reforms as yet through the FAST Act to streamline the permitting process. However, we're asking now we're having hearings to do even additional streamlines to that, but we haven't even seen what the reforms that we recently passed have been. And it would be my position that we should wait for the reports to come back, impress on the President the need to fill those slots to be able to, so that Congress can get the reforms back, statistical analysis to determine if there's additional work that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Iwaniki, I heard the story about how all the back and forth you went with the EPA and Corps of Engineers. To me, it just sounds crazy. The Corps and the EPA and your county government, the state government of Michigan, aren't we all supposed to be on the same team looking out for the people and the environment?
I believe you're correct, and I guess that was the most frustrating part of the whole experience, is that the EPA kept moving the goalposts on us. They kept moving the goal line, and every time we came up
somebody in your office just make somebody at the EPA mad and say we're going to stick it to them, or do you think this is? I mean, was there a personality problem? It seems.
I don't think there was a personality problem. I think there was an issue problem. And I think they were trying to make an issue, in my opinion, of mining in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And, you know, we helped build this country with our copper mining and iron ore mining. And we are a resource area for this country. And when you have places like Copper Harbor, Ironwood, Iron Mountain, and you got 2 local papers called the Mining Gazette and the Mining Journal.
I've visited the area. I've actually driven by some of those folks.
Those resources are important to us, and we need to make sure that we do it responsibly and have the ability to get those resources to the rest of the country.
Just out of a point of personal curiosity for me, you talked about bear and cougar crossings. How do those work? My experience with most wild animals in Texas is they cross the road where they want to cross the road.
That was a very frustrating issue with this permit process because You know, up until like a month before or several months before, they didn't even recognize cougar in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And when asked where they wanted them, they would not tell us where they wanted them, and they wanted us also to place fencing to channel the animals to those crossings.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Wilkinson, you talked about your long process. I think you outlined 3 definitional changes of what a wetland is based on the Corps and the EPA. Is there a settled upon definition now?
It varies from district to district. The regulations are extremely confusing and vague and seem to be capricious in their application. Our experts in the field, who this is their life, what they do, can't second guess and can't go in knowing what is going to be claimed as jurisdictional, and a lot of that has to do with primary and secondary indicators. Understand in our area in Chesapeake, Virginia, the land we're often talking about is seasonably wet. To the surface means actually 12 inches below the surface. And it's non-tidal forested land. So if you went out and walked on it or were on it, you would not think of this as the type of wetland aquatic resource that we typically do.
And are there no endangered species or anything that?
No, we have gotten letters to that extent. That has been dealt with with U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
And you've actually offered to mitigate on additional property and create substantially more wetlands than would be affected under every Corps report. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely we did. And that's why the DEQ held us up kind of as an epitome of the permitting process when we, again, through the 404 regulation, so that's a...
So does this change based on, I know the Corps rotates in new colonels every 3 years. Does this change based on that leadership, or you think it's beyond just who happens to be in charge of your Corps district at the time?
It's a combination. It's changes at the Corps, changes at the EPA, also the changes in the interpretations of the regulations when the supplements come out or any additional information. So it's kind of all of the above adds to this ever-changing environment.
Okay. And Ms. Katz, you talked about waivers that came out specifically during the stimulus under the previous administration. And are the waivers sometimes politically based, or are they more factually based? How arbitrary is the waiver process?
Well, what I can tell you is that each agency comes up with its own waivers, and there is no oversight over, whether the waivers they come up with, have a solid basis beneath them. So there's a great deal of arbitrariness in terms of what a waiver is and who gets it.
And just real quick, because I'm out of time, but I do want to ask one other question, if the committee will indulge me. Mr. Waneke suggested that maybe part of his issue getting permitted was the environmental effects of something that the road would be servicing, or the policy of not wanting to do mining in that area. Do you see that in other places, Ms. Katz?
Absolutely. I'm a regulatory expert, and I follow all of these things very, very closely. And the political science drives much of our regulatory decision-making and policy much more than natural science.
All right, thank you. I see I did go over 45 seconds. Thank you for the indulgence. I think before we vote, we do have time for one more round of questioning, since there are only 3 of us here. So I'll recognize Mr. Palmer again for 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Good said that about 9 out of every 10 projects are not subject to delay. Is that correct?
Again, it depends on the category of project that we're talking about.
Okay,
but
small projects, for instance?
I meant across different federal agencies, but yes, typically speaking, and again, I can speak most to surface transportation, yes, 9 out of 10 or better are
that hasn't
categorically
been
excluded.
our experience in Alabama, so I'm not going to dispute what you're saying, although I think we will research it extensively to see if if that is the case, but like I said, it's not our experience in Alabama. But given that you've made that statement that 9 out of 10 small projects are not subject to delay, would you support an exemption of projects that are less than $5 million in federal funding, which was, based on the flexibility that was in MAP 21 and the FAST Act? Could we?
The impacts are not tied to the dollar amount. The impact has to do with the type
No,
of
I'm
work in
asking you.
question. No, I would not. No, I would not. It's not a question of
I
dollars.
didn't think you would, but I thought I'd ask you anyway, just in case. But I want to give you an example of, and this is in your district, I believe, or close to it. It may not be. I don't know all the districts in Texas, but in Houston, I got small, medium, and large. It sounds like
Everything's large in Texas.
Yeah, everything's large in Texas. Well, when you hear this, you're going to appreciate how large some things are in Texas. For instance, for a small project, 2.7-mile long widening of a local road was delayed 33 and a half months. It cost $96,000 a month, Mr. Chairman, in delays, $3.5 million total. Now you get to the medium-sized projects, which was on U.S. Highway 59. It was a 2.6-mile long widening. That was delayed almost 5 years, and that cost $297,000 a month. That's about almost $18 million. And then one more, large, we won't stay on this lineup. So 1.5-mile long interchange on I-10, that was an 11-month delay, $447,000 per month, $5.1 million. It's an enormously wasteful deal going on here with a lot of permitting delays that are absolutely unnecessary. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'll now recognize Ms. Plaskett for 5 more minutes of questions.
Sure, I don't know if I have 5 more minutes, but first I did want to say, Mr. Iwaniki and Ms. Wilkinson, I really understand what you're going through. In the Virgin Islands, we have had projects for whether it be National Marine Fisheries, Army Corps of Engineers, or others that have taken years for permitting, as well as our own permitting processes. Then when you get the Endangered Species Act on top of it, that can really drive the length of time in which we've had projects that have been delayed because in the interim that the project was initially drawn up, other species were put on the list after the initial project, which changed things as well. So I really do empathize and understand the issues that you're talking about. But one of the things I'm hopeful for is that I have been with the chairman very much in favor of some kind of streamlining, and it's my hope that the FAST Act will do some of that, and once we do an evaluation of that, determine how we can do even more to assist. But one of the things that I think is an even larger issue is the lack of funding, the lack of support that those who are doing this process have. The Army Corps of Engineers, National Marine Fisheries, those at environmental protection agencies, to be able to address the needs and the uptick in the amount of projects that Americans are trying to do to improve their roads, their ports, et cetera. And so I'm hopeful that rather than cutting in funding, we can support the scientists and others who are willing to do that so that we compete with other places such as France and Europe. For the Virgin Islands, we're competing with places like St. Martin and Cuba, who have no EPA, who may be building beautiful buildings very quickly, but I guarantee 20 years from now, those buildings will be at fault and the environment will be compromised. Mr. DeGood, did you have anything? I see you nodding your head emphatically. I love when people are agreeing with what I said. Please help me here.
Sure. I'll just throw out a number, I think, to put a perspective on this when we talk about investment and what does it mean when the federal government plays a leadership role. If we look in real inflation-adjusted terms, 1955, before the passage of the Interstate Highway Act, compared to 1970, the federal government increased its expenditures on highway construction, again, in real dollar terms, by 543%. That's what it means to say that you have a national program of infrastructure investment. That's what it means for the federal government to play a leadership role. So I think if we want to be serious about addressing the backlog that you addressed in your opening remarks, that the Army Corps, that the American Society of Civil Engineers has put forward, that's the level of federal involvement that we need to see.
And now I agree. I heard Ms. Katz say that's because they were building it as opposed to repairing or fixing it, correct?
They were building the interstate system.
Right. And I think right now we're at a place in time where we can have a 1950s building an interstate system that it was created in 1950s in the 21st century. Other places like Japan, Europe have just gone 3 generations ahead of us while we're just trying to repair a 1950s system rather than rebuilding a completely new system that meets the 21st century and beyond. So I think that it's time for us to be investing in this so that we can not only keep up, but still be the innovators and the new, as my kids say, the new that's out there for the world. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I'll now recognize myself for the second round of questioning, and then we'll let you guys go. I want to talk for a second about the EPA's ability under Section 404 to retroactively kill a project. Mr. Iwanowski, can you tell us how that affects public projects or public-private partnerships?
I don't have any direct experience with them killing a project after it's been permitted, but I know that what they did with our mining project, or with our road project for the mine, was that you know, my counterparts in the UP needed us to challenge them because they were afraid if they used those same standards on all our roads in the UP, we couldn't do anything to fix them or create new ones for our citizens.
Great. Ms. Wilkinson, you want to talk about how, as a private entity looking to do some development, the prospect of, after getting your permit and potentially being under construction, the EPA coming in and vetoing your permit would affect that?
Yeah, uncertainty is detrimental to any project. It makes it very difficult when you're making your initial investment decisions. It makes it difficult to attract equity investors. It makes it difficult to get loans. When they're concerned that you could be moving forward and have a problem, you know, we don't have a seat at the table with these other agencies. The Corps is the one day-to-day that we're dealing with, and it's a very difficult hill to climb to know that you could make it through all of this time, these years, this entire process, and then have a veto.
I can understand the frustration. Just moving the goalpost is bad enough, but after you've scored, taking the points off the board has got to be even worse. Ms. Katz, Mr. Iwanowski talked a little bit about the mining industry in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's my understanding that there is a real issue here. We've got testimony submitted for the record that indicates the United States only attracted about 7% of worldwide mining exploration dollars in 2016, down nearly 20% from the late 90s, due in significant part to our overly burdensome, unpredictable permitting system. Have you seen other evidence that permitting problems negatively impact U.S. competitiveness, and are there signs of similar effects in other sectors of the economy?
There certainly are, and in my testimony, my full testimony, as well as in my remarks here today, you know, I noted just a couple of the survey results that are related to business receptiveness in different countries. And the U.S. has been losing ground to other countries because just in the Obama administration alone, the regulatory burden, cost burden increased $122 billion a year. That's on top of what already existed. And so the regulatory load is becoming unsustainable. And when that happens, people take their money elsewhere.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's testimony. I'd like to thank the members and staff for putting together a great hearing and the work you and the folks that helped you did. I'd like to thank you all for appearing before us today. We'll keep the record open for 2 weeks for any members to submit written opening statements or questions. If we get any of those questions, we'll forward those to you by mail and would appreciate your taking a few moments to answer those. If there's no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.